Welcome. This will be my final video discussion for our class, and I just want to spend a few minutes reviewing the central ideas that I'm asking you to explore in the final exam. I've tried to construct the exam question in a way that is responsible to the work we've done in the class, even though the classroom meetings were disrupted. We were able to work through the rest of the material. However, I didn't want the exam to focus on later material that we weren't able to discuss collectively. There's an opportunity to draw it in if you found any of it interesting and useful. But if you didn't, or if you aren't comfortable integrating that material with your existing knowledge on the basis just of the notes and the video discussions, you don't have to, the question is formulated in such a way that it can be answered very well without having to touch on any of the later material. You will have to provide your own explanation of what education as a practice of cognitive freedom means. So to that end, earlier today, I posted a very brief review which we went over in the transitional period from Dewey and Freire to the second half of the course, but I thought I would provide some notes on those crucial ideas. Now, I caution that you need to translate that review into your own ideas, your own voice, especially because whatever else it means, education as a practice of cognitive freedom means that we can think for ourselves, right? Which doesn't mean that we create every idea out of nothing, or that everything that runs through our heads is absolutely unique and has never been thought of by any other person before in history. But what it does mean is that we have to connect whatever the general set of ideas is to our own concerns, articulate the ideas in our own words, translate that, explain them, justify them, illustrate them through our own examples, right? And that's what I'm looking for in the first part of the exam question. The first part of the exam asks you to explain in your own words what education as a practice of cognitive freedom means. From my perspective, and this is the focus of the brief notes that I just posted, from my perspective, it means two things. On the one hand, practice of education as a practice of cognitive freedom means that educated people are free from dependence on other people's ideas. Right? Think of all of the different hocus pocus remedies circulating on the internet about the COVID virus. Right? Educated people are not necessarily biochemists, they're not necessarily medical doctors, but they should have the critical faculties to be able to smell a rat, to be able to say, this sounds too good to be true. I'm going to investigate this in more detail. Right? So you're not dependent on what you see, whether it's online or whether it's something somebody tells you in the street, a book you read, a newspaper, a website. We are not educated people are not dependent on other people's ideas. We can think them through critically for ourselves. Of course, we're not closed off to other people. The issue is whether you have the critical faculties required to test claims that are made. Do you have the ability to understand the context in which you're operating? Right? Do you understand that there can be a confusion between people's private interests and truth claims they make? And when that's the case, you certainly want to critically scrutinize what they say, because when they say X is true, what they really might be meaning is, this will make me money. This will provide some private advantage to me. So the freedom from is vitally important. Right? And it doesn't mean that we're uncritical skeptics, as I try to emphasize throughout the class. Right? There's a difference between education, criticism, intelligent suspicion, and a sort of childish skepticism that just says no, 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 no all the time, or can always pose a question, always poke a hole without ever saying anything positive. So that's the first side of education as cognitive freedom. But there's a positive side as well. Education as a practice of cognitive freedom means that educated people are also able to think for themselves, right? Not only pose questions, not only expose contradictions, but make arguments, provide interpretations, provide evaluations that are, of course, draw on other ideas, a history of ideas that connect up with things that we've studied, things that we've learned through experience, things that we've learned from other people. Thinking for oneself doesn't mean thinking everything up originally, right? All human thinking, even the greatest geniuses, depend on work done prior to them, right? As Newton famously said, if I've seen so far, it's because I've stood on the shoulders of giants, right? The pioneering work of Galileo and others, right? So nobody is a sui generis genius that thinks everything up for themselves. But if we can think for ourselves, we can make arguments and evaluations on our own terms from our own perspective and articulate them in a way that other people can interact with. They can understand them, they can criticize them, they can build on them, they can reject them, but you're not simply giving us your own opinion, right? Everybody has opinions, right? Education has to refine those opinions into defensible arguments, into evaluations that other people can evaluate in turn. So you're not simply talking about what's going on in your own head. You're saying, this is how I interact with the world out there. This is what I think's going on. Here's an account of why I take this to be true, and here's an account of why I take this to be false. Here's why I think this is a great movie or a great painting. Here's why so-and-so is a true friend, right? And when we make arguments and evaluations as educated people, we're laying out our subjective position in a way that tries to touch objects in the world so that the evaluation can in turn be evaluated. And that's how educated people can, if everything works out as best it can, enter into a dialogue with each other, right? There is struggle and strife enough in the world, right? Educated people don't necessarily cohere in their positions, but they can understand each other. And so that's the final component. When we put together the negative and the positive aspects of cognitive freedom, we arrive at the idea of the educated person as disposed in an intelligent and intelligible way to the world, right? We don't stomp our feet and insist on our own way. We make claims, and then we're receptive to how other people pick up those claims, right? If they're criticized, we don't close ourselves off to the criticism. We listen to it, right? And we see if there's something there, something that might allow us to reconstruct our argument and make a better one, to make it more comprehensively whole. Right? I mean, I think that's a vitally important idea, and it was first expressed in McMurtry's essay on education in the market model. Right? Truth grows by taking more information into account and reconstructing arguments so that our position on events or artifacts or people or problems takes more into account. Right? So the more true and the more objective doesn't mean it's our theories mechanically match up to a reality out there. They provide more comprehensive interpretations and evaluations of situations. And that has important social and political effects. Right? We live in a world, as we discussed many times, where there are still histories of oppression, where people have different perspectives, different positions, different concrete needs. How do we all live together? Right? We have certainly had enough in human history of living together by a dominant group subordinating supposed inferiors and treating them like mere objects. But as we become educated, as the oppressed become educated, to use Freire's term, right, they discover their own subjectivity. Right? And they realize they are not mere things for use, but have the right and the capacity to speak in their own voice. But that political implication, I think, is secondary. In the deepest sense, at least from my perspective, but you can also, of course, disagree and make your own argument. But from my perspective, the political implications, the institutional changes that educated people might make as a result of creating political movements in response to a diagnosed problem, those are secondary. First, we need the capacity to recognize that the world has come to be, that it has a history, and therefore that it can be changed. Right? And education frees us from the idea that things are fixed and given. So that's all by way of review. I don't think there's anything new. And the first part of the exam question asks you to discuss education as a practice of cognitive freedom in your own terms. The second half asks you to confront that conception of cognitive freedom with a problem that we also discussed, right? And that problem stems from the fact that educational institutions also have a social role to educate the next generation of citizens to take on certain functional roles in the society as workers, as citizens, etc., and so forth. So is my conception, I shouldn't say my conception, is the way in which we defined education as a practice of cognitive freedom, is that inappropriately imposed upon